The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the five-star restaurant, and my wife looked at me with eyes colder than the ice melting in her drink and said, "Sign the papers or I'll make sure you lose everything in court. Marcus has lawyers that will bury you so deep, you'll forget what sunlight looks like." That was the moment I realized Jessica hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd been weaponized by a man I'd spent the last 6 weeks investigating. A billionaire whose empire was built on lies so massive they could destroy thousands of lives. And as the other diners stared at our table in uncomfortable silence, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled, picked up my pen, and signed every page without reading a single word because I knew something she didn't. Something that would turn her fairy tale into a nightmare. You see, 3 months earlier, I'd discovered a text message on her phone that led me down a rabbit hole of corporate fraud, stolen data, and criminal conspiracy. And the man she was leaving me for, Marcus Chambers, tech billionaire and humanitarian of the year, was actually running the biggest cybersecurity scam in history, selling protection while simultaneously selling his clients' secrets to the highest bidders. And I'd spent every night since then building a case that would destroy him. But that night at the restaurant, watching Jessica slide the divorce papers back into her designer purse, the one Marcus had bought her along with the Mercedes and the promise of a 7-figure salary. I didn't say any of that. I just watched her stand up, smooth down her $1,000 dress, and deliver the line that would haunt both of us forever. "You are always too small to see the bigger picture, but don't worry. Marcus says you'll understand one day when you finally grow up." She walked out of that restaurant like she was walking into a better future. But I knew the truth. She was walking into a trap, and I was about to spring it in front of the whole world. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about hurting someone. It's about saving them from themselves, even when they don't deserve it. 10 weeks later, I would stand up in the middle of a black-tie gala with every major news outlet watching and say 7 words that would destroy a $3 billion empire. But before I tell you about that night, you need to understand how a regular guy like me ended up going to war with one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley, and how my wife's betrayal became the key to exposing the biggest fraud of the decade. What Jessica didn't know was that every text she'd sent, every lie she'd told, and every choice she'd made had been leading to a moment that would change all our lives forever. Alright, before we move forward, make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to tell you is the turning point that changed everything. 3 months before that anniversary dinner, I was sitting in my modest home office paying bills when Jessica's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. And because we'd always had each other's passwords, because we'd built our marriage on trust, I glanced at the screen and saw a text from someone named M. that read, "Can't wait to show you the penthouse tonight. Wear something that makes me forget my own name." My hands went cold. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to confront her immediately. But something deeper, something quieter, told me to wait, to watch, to learn. And that decision changed everything. I started following her, not in some creepy, obsessive way, but carefully and methodically, using the same research skills that made me a decent financial analyst before. Jessica convinced me to take a less stressful job so she could pursue her real estate career. And what I discovered was that M was Marcus Chambers, the man whose face was plastered across Forbes, TechCrunch, and every major business publication as the next Elon Musk, the visionary who'd built a $3 billion cybersecurity empire in just 5 years. Jessica had met him at an open house for a $50 million estate, and apparently she'd gone from showing him properties to becoming one. But as I dug deeper into Marcus's background, something felt off. His company, SecureNet AI, had exploded onto the scene with almost no history. His previous ventures were barely documented, and his philanthropic donations, while impressive, seemed perfectly timed to generate maximum publicity right before major investment rounds. I started compiling everything I could find: CTA filings, investor reports, employee reviews on Glassdoor, archived news articles, even social media posts from former employees who'd mysteriously gone silent. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that Marcus Chambers wasn't just a bad man. He was a criminal mastermind who'd built his empire on fraud. And my wife was about to become collateral damage, but before I could warn her, she made a choice that would change both our lives forever. Jessica served me the papers 2 weeks after I'd started my investigation, and she did it with the cold efficiency of someone who'd already moved on emotionally months ago. She sat across from me in our living room, the same room where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and planned a future that now felt like a cruel joke. And she said, "I'm not going to apologize for choosing happiness. You've been comfortable with mediocrity our entire marriage. And I finally met someone who understands ambition." I wanted to scream, to show her everything I'd found, to shake her and make her see that she was walking into a trap. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was hurt, or maybe it was the realization that she'd already made her choice and nothing I said would matter until she learned the truth the hard way. She told me Marcus had offered her a position as director of luxury real estate for his property development division, a job that came with a 7-figure salary and a lifestyle she'd only dreamed about. And she looked at me like I was supposed to be happy for her, like I was supposed to just accept that our 10-year marriage meant less than a penthouse view and a black American Express card. I signed the papers that day, but I didn't sign them as a defeated man. I signed them as someone who knew the truth and was willing to wait for the perfect moment to reveal it. Because Marcus Chambers had built his empire on deception, and I was about to become his worst nightmare, not because I wanted revenge, but because what he was doing was going to hurt thousands of people, including the woman I'd once loved. Jessica moved out the next week, and as I watched the moving truck pull away with half our furniture, I opened my laptop and sent an encrypted email to someone I'd found during my research, a former SecureNet employee who tried to blow the whistle 2 years ago and had been silenced with an NDA and a substantial payout. The email simply said, "I know what happened to Project Phantom, and I have proof." Within 24 hours, I received a response that would set everything in motion. Her name was Rachel Chun, and when we met at a quiet coffee shop 40 miles outside the city, she looked like someone who'd been running from shadows for years. Dark circles under her eyes, hands that trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee, and a voice that dropped to barely a whisper when she said, "If you're really doing this, you need to understand that Marcus doesn't just ruin careers. He destroys lives." Rachel had been a senior software engineer at SecureNet, one of the original team members who'd believed in the company's mission to protect businesses from cyber threats. But 6 months into the job, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The AI security system that Marcus was selling to Fortune 500 companies, banks, hospitals, and government agencies didn't actually work the way he claimed it did. She pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table, her eyes darting to the door like she expected someone to burst in at any moment. And she explained that SecureNet's revolutionary AI was actually just a sophisticated facade. It looked impressive in demonstrations, it passed basic security audits, but it had a backdoor that Marcus had intentionally built into the system. A backdoor that allowed him to access every single client's data whenever he wanted. "He's been selling security while simultaneously creating the biggest data breach in history," Rachel said, her voice cracking with the weight of what she knew. "And he's been quietly selling that stolen data to the highest bidders, foreign governments, corporate spies, even criminal organizations. That's how he made his real fortune. Not through legitimate business, but through betrayal on a scale most people can't even comprehend." I felt sick as I listened, not just because of the magnitude of the crime, but because Jessica was now part of this. She'd tied her future to a man who was essentially a digital terrorist in a $1,000 suit. And when the truth came out, and it would come out, she'd be caught in the blast radius. Rachel made me promise that I'd protect her identity, that I'd use the evidence carefully, and as we parted ways in that parking lot, she grabbed my arm and said something I'll never forget. "Marcus has friends in very high places. People who've profited from this scheme and will do anything to keep it hidden. So be careful, because once you start this, there's no turning back." I walked away from that meeting knowing I'd just declared war on a man who had the power to destroy me, but I also knew I couldn't stop now. For the next 4 weeks, I lived like a man possessed, barely sleeping, barely eating, spending every waking moment analyzing the data Rachel had given me and cross-referencing it with public records, financial statements, and news reports about unexplained data breaches at companies that had hired SecureNet. My small apartment became a war room, papers covering every surface, multiple laptops running analysis programs, a whiteboard filled with connections between Marcus, his investors, and a web of shell companies that traced back to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. And the picture that emerged was more horrifying than I'd imagined. Marcus hadn't just stolen data from his clients, he'd weaponized it, using the information to manipulate stock prices, blackmail executives, and sell corporate secrets to competitors. And every charitable donation he made, every smiling photo op at a children's hospital, every glowing interview about his vision for a safer digital future was just another layer of insulation between him and the crimes he was committing. I found evidence of at least 17 major corporations that had experienced mysterious data breaches within months of installing SecureNet systems, breaches that had cost them millions in losses and damaged countless lives. But Marcus had been so careful, so methodical, that no one had connected the dots because he was always the first person to offer sympathy and additional security services after each breach, making himself look like a hero while he was actually the villain. I knew I needed more than just data, I needed witnesses. So I started reaching out to other former SecureNet employees, and slowly, carefully, I began to assemble a network of people who'd seen glimpses of the truth and had been too afraid to speak up. People who'd been threatened, paid off, or discredited when they'd tried to raise concerns. One former executive told me about a board meeting where Marcus had laughed about how easy it was to fool security experts because they're so desperate to believe in magic, solutions that they don't ask the hard questions. And another employee described watching Marcus deliberately sabotage a competitor's pitch to a major client by using stolen data to expose their vulnerabilities, then swooping in with SecureNet as the obvious solution. Every conversation, every document, every piece of evidence made me more certain that I was doing the right thing. But it also made me realize just how dangerous Marcus really was, because this wasn't just corporate fraud. This was organized crime dressed up in Silicon Valley casual and venture capital funding. And then, just when I thought I had enough evidence to go public, Jessica called me, and what she said made my blood run cold. It was 2 a.m. when my phone rang, and Jessica's name flashing on the screen sent a jolt through my system because we hadn't spoken since. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks earlier, and when I answered, her voice was different, not the confident, cold tone she'd used when she left me, but something fragile, almost frightened. "I need to talk to you," she said, and I could hear background noise, like she was calling from a bathroom or closet, somewhere private. "Something's not right with Marcus. I think he's been lying to me about things, important things." My first instinct was satisfaction, a petty part of me that wanted to say "I told you so." But the vulnerability in her voice stopped me, and instead I asked what happened. And what she told me made me realize that Marcus knew I was investigating him. Jessica explained that she'd overheard a phone conversation where Marcus was talking about handling a problem, and he'd mentioned my name, said something about me sticking my nose where it doesn't belong and needing to neutralize the situation before it becomes a liability, and the coldness in his voice had terrified her because she'd never heard him talk that way before. Like I was just an obstacle to be removed, not a person. She said she'd started noticing other things too. The way Marcus's business partners looked at her with pity, as if they knew something she didn't. The locked office in his penthouse that she was never allowed to enter. The frequent trips to meet with investors that always seemed to happen in countries with loose extradition laws. And the way he'd insisted she sign a dozen different NDAs, and agreements that she'd barely read because she'd been so dazzled by the lifestyle he was offering. "I think I made a terrible mistake," Jessica whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I thought he was everything you weren't, ambitious, powerful, successful. But now I'm starting to think he's something much worse. And I'm scared of what he might do if I try to leave." I wanted to feel vindicated, to let her suffer the consequences of her choices. But I couldn't because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, I still cared about her safety. And I knew that Marcus Chambers was capable of far worse than breaking hearts. I told her to be careful, to not let Marcus know she'd called me, to keep acting normal while I figured out what to do next, and as we hung up, I realized that the stakes had just gotten exponentially higher, because now it wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about protecting Jessica from a man who saw human beings as expendable assets. What I didn't know was that Marcus had already set his plan in motion, and I was walking straight into his trap. 2 days after Jessica's call, I received an email from someone claiming to be an investigative journalist from a major publication, saying they'd heard rumors about SecureNet and wanted to meet to discuss what I knew. And like an idiot, I believed it was legitimate. I believed that my evidence had started making waves and that the media was finally paying attention. We agreed to meet at a downtown hotel bar, somewhere public and safe, and when I arrived with a laptop containing copies of everything I'd compiled, I immediately noticed the man sitting at the corner table didn't look like any journalist I'd ever seen. Too polished, too expensive, and his eyes had that cold, calculating quality that reminded me of Marcus. He introduced himself as David something, flashed a press credential that looked real enough, and started asking questions that seemed designed to figure out exactly how much I knew and who I'd talked to. And halfway through the conversation, I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a journalist. This was someone Marcus had sent to assess the threat I posed. I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom, grabbed my laptop, and walked quickly toward the exit. But as I pushed through the door, I saw 2 men in dark suits standing by my car in the parking garage, and every instinct screamed at me to run. So I did. I ran through the garage, through a service entrance, into a busy street where I could disappear into the crowd, and I didn't stop until I was miles away, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, realizing that Marcus had just shown me exactly how far he was willing to go. I couldn't go home, couldn't go anywhere Marcus might expect, so I checked into a cheap motel under a fake name and spent the night reviewing my options. And none of them were good, because if I went to the police, Marcus had enough money and connections to make any accusations disappear. If I went to the media without an ironclad case, he'd sue me into oblivion and discredit everything I'd found. And if I did nothing, thousands of people would continue to be victimized by his scheme. But then I remembered something Rachel had told me. That Marcus's biggest fear wasn't exposure, it was losing control of the narrative. He'd built his entire empire on image and perception. And if I could shatter that image publicly, dramatically, and undeniably, his house of cards would collapse before he could stop it. I needed a platform, an audience, and a moment when Marcus couldn't hide. And as I sat in that dingy motel room with a laptop and a dream of justice, I started planning something that would either destroy Marcus Chambers or destroy me. There would be no middle ground. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, and it would happen at the one place Marcus felt most invincible. Marcus was being honored at the annual Tech Innovators Gala, a black tie event where billionaires and investors gathered to celebrate themselves and pretend they were changing the world. And he was receiving the Humanitarian of the Year award for his charitable work, which made me want to vomit considering what I knew about how he'd made his fortune. Jessica had mentioned the gala during our last call, said Marcus was treating it like his coronation, inviting every major media outlet and planning to announce an expansion of SecureNet that would make him even richer. And as I researched the event, I realized it was perfect. Hundreds of witnesses, live media coverage, and Marcus would be so focused on his moment of glory that he'd never see me coming. I reached out to every contact I'd made during my investigation, sent encrypted packages of evidence to trusted journalists with instructions to publish only if something happened to me. And I arranged for Rachel to be in a safe location with copies of everything we'd uncovered. Because I knew that once I did this, there would be no going back. Marcus would come after me with everything he had, but at least the truth would be out there. Getting into the gala was easier than expected because I still had friends in the industry. People who owed me favors and didn't ask too many questions when I said I needed a last-minute ticket. And when I walked into that glittering ballroom in a rented tuxedo, surrounded by people who had no idea they were celebrating a criminal, I felt a strange calm settle over me because I'd spent 3 months living in fear and uncertainty, and now, finally, I was going to do something about it. Marcus was holding court at the center of the room, Jessica on his arm looking beautiful and miserable in a dress that probably cost more than our old car, and he was laughing, shaking hands, playing the role of benevolent genius to perfection, and I watched him for a moment, studying the man who'd stolen my wife and built an empire on lies. And I realized he wasn't special, he wasn't brilliant. He was just ruthless enough to do things that decent people wouldn't. The award ceremony began, and Marcus took the stage to thunderous applause, his speech full of platitudes about innovation and responsibility in building a better future. And I waited, letting him bask in his moment, letting him think he'd won, and then, just as he was thanking his investors and partners, I stood up, and in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire ballroom, I said the words that would change everything. Everything Marcus Chambers just told you is a lie, and I can prove it. The ballroom went silent, hundreds of faces turning toward me like I'd just set off a bomb, and Marcus's expression shifted from shock to fury in the span of a heartbeat. But before security could reach me, I held up my phone and said, "I'm streaming this live to 50,000 people right now, and if anyone tries to stop me, it'll look like you have something to hide?" I'd spent the last 2 days setting up multiple live streams, backup accounts, and automated systems that would release all my evidence if I didn't check in every hour. And now, with cameras from major news outlets already in the room, I had the platform I needed. I started talking, explaining how SecureNet's security systems were actually sophisticated backdoors, how Marcus had been stealing and selling data from every client he'd ever had, how his entire fortune was built on fraud and betrayal, and as I spoke, I could see the audience's expressions change from annoyance to confusion to horror. Marcus tried to interrupt, tried to dismiss me as a disgruntled former spouse of an employee who was making wild accusations. But I'd prepared for that. I pulled out my laptop, connected it to the venue's projection system that I'd hacked earlier that day, and suddenly the giant screens behind Marcus filled with evidence. Emails between him and data brokers, financial records showing payments from shell companies, security logs proving the backdoor existed, and most damning of all, a video confession from Rachel Chun explaining exactly how the scheme worked. The room erupted in chaos, investors shouting questions, journalists rushing forward with cameras, and Marcus standing frozen on stage as his carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. And I watched Jessica's face as she realized what the man she'd left me for really was. Watched her cover her mouth in horror, watched her sink into a chair as the truth crashed over her like a wave. Security did eventually escort me out, but by then it didn't matter. The story was already going viral, hashtags were trending. News websites were publishing breaking news alerts, and law enforcement agencies that had been quietly investigating SecureNet for months suddenly had the public pressure they needed to act. I was arrested, questioned, released, arrested again on charges that Marcus's lawyers tried to make stick. But nothing worked because I'd been careful. Everything I'd done was legal, and more importantly, I'd become a folk hero overnight, the little guy who'd taken down a corrupt billionaire. And Marcus couldn't make me disappear without proving everything I'd said was true. Within 48 hours, the secure of SecureNet's assets, the FBI raided Marcus's offices and homes, and his investors filed lawsuits that would tie him up in court for years. And I sat in my small apartment watching it all unfold on the news, feeling exhausted and vindicated and somehow still sad. because victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would, but the real revelation came 3 days later, when Jessica showed up at my door with something I never expected. Jessica looked different standing in my doorway. No designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, just jeans and a sweater and eyes that had cried themselves dry. And when she asked if we could talk, I almost said no. Almost told her that she'd made her choice and now she had to live with it. But something in her expression stopped me. Something broken and honest that I hadn't seen in months. She sat on my old couch, the one she'd left behind when she moved out, and she started talking, not making excuses, not asking for forgiveness, but telling me the truth about what had really happened. And what she said made me see everything differently. Jessica explained that Marcus hadn't just seduced her with money and luxury. He'd systematically manipulated her, used tactics she didn't recognize as manipulation until it was too late. Started by complimenting her at that open house, then gradually making her feel special, understood, appreciated in ways she hadn't felt in our marriage, and I had to admit, as painful as it was to hear, that she was right. I'd gotten comfortable, stopped trying, stopped seeing her as someone who needed to feel valued. But Marcus hadn't stopped at seduction. He'd isolated her from friends, convinced her that I was holding her back, made her financially dependent on him by having her quit her real estate job to work for his company. And by the time she realized something was wrong, she felt trapped, scared, and ashamed to admit she'd made a mistake. She told me about the night she'd called me from Marcus's penthouse, how she'd found documents that proved he was planning to frame her for some of his crimes if his empire ever fell, how she'd been designated as the fall person, the ambitious girlfriend who'd helped him commit fraud out of greed, and how she'd realized that, to Marcus, she'd never been a partner, just another asset to be used and discarded. "I didn't leave you because I stopped loving you," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "I left because he made me believe that love wasn't enough, that I deserved more, deserved better, and I was so stupid and selfish that I believed him. And by the time I understood what I'd done, I thought it was too late to fix it." I sat there listening, feeling a complicated mix of anger and sadness and something that might have been understanding, because I'd spent months thinking Jessica was the villain in this story, but the truth was more complicated. She'd been a victim too, just a different kind, and maybe we'd both failed each other long before Marcus ever entered the picture. She didn't ask to get back together, didn't expect forgiveness, she just wanted me to know the truth. And as she stood to leave, she turned and said, "Thank you for exposing him. You saved a lot of people, including me, even though I didn't deserve it." After she left, I sat alone in my apartment and realized that revenge had never been what this was really about. Marcus Chambers was arrested 6 days after the gala, led out of his penthouse in handcuffs while news helicopters captured every moment, and the charges against him read like a crime novel. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, illegal data trafficking, and about 20 other felonies that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. His empire disintegrated overnight. SecureNet filed for bankruptcy, investors lost billions, and hundreds of employees who'd had nothing to do with his schemes found themselves unemployed. And that was the part that haunted me, because my pursuit of justice had destroyed lives of innocent people too. People who'd just been trying to make a living and had no idea their CEO was a criminal. I testified at multiple hearings, gave interviews to investigative journalists, and slowly the full scope of Marcus's crimes emerged. He'd compromised data from over 300 companies, exposed personal information of millions of individuals, and facilitated corporate espionage that had damaged national security. And the prosecutors told me that my evidence was the key that unlocked everything, that without it, Marcus might have gotten away with it for years. Rachel Chun was vindicated. Other whistleblowers came forward, and gradually, a picture emerged of a man so obsessed with wealth and power that he'd lost any sense of morality or humanity. And I found myself pitying him in a strange way, because what kind of emptiness drives someone to betray everyone they touch? Jessica reached out a few times over the following months, Not to rekindle our relationship, but to update me on her therapy, her efforts to rebuild her life, and her cooperation with law enforcement. And gradually we found a friendship, not the marriage we'd had, but something honest and healing. And she told me once that losing everything had taught her more about herself than all her years of success ever had. I went back to financial analysis, got a better job at a firm that actually valued my skills, and started rebuilding the life I'd let atrophy while I was comfortable and complacent. And the irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's betrayal had forced both Jessica and me to become better versions of ourselves. The media called me a hero, but I didn't feel heroic. I felt like someone who'd done what was necessary, who'd refused to look away when he saw something wrong, and if there was any satisfaction in it, it was knowing that thousands of people were safer because Marcus's scheme had been exposed, that future victims had been spared, and that truth had won. Even if the victory was messy and complicated, but the real ending to this story came almost a year later, in a moment I never saw coming. I was having coffee at my usual spot, reading the news on my tablet, when I saw Jessica walk by on the sidewalk, and she looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in years, lighter somehow. And when she noticed me through the window and waved, I gestured for her to come in. We talked for an hour, catching up on our separate lives, and she told me she was dating someone new, a high school teacher who made her laugh and didn't care about luxury brands or social status. Someone who reminded her of who she used to be before ambition had poisoned her priorities, and I found myself genuinely happy for her, because her happiness no longer felt like a threat to mine. She asked about my life, and I told her I was dating too, nothing serious yet, but I was learning to be open again, to trust again, and to recognize that our marriage ending wasn't just her fault, that I'd contributed to its decline by choosing comfort over growth, security over passion, and routine over romance. We were both broken, Jessica said. Marcus didn't break us. He just exploited cracks that were already there. And maybe we needed to fall apart so we could rebuild ourselves properly. She was right. And as we sat there in that coffee shop, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or condoning what she'd done. It was about releasing the poison of resentment so I could move forward. And maybe that was the real revenge against Marcus, refusing to let his toxicity define the rest of our lives. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me pictures from her therapy group, a community of people who'd been manipulated by narcissists and sociopaths, and she'd become an advocate, using her experience to help others recognize the warning signs. And I thought about how suffering can either destroy us or transform us, and we both chosen transformation. As we said goodbye outside the coffee shop, Jessica hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on truth, even when it meant losing me." And I realized that what I'd done wasn't about saving my marriage or getting revenge. It was about refusing to be complicit in someone else's evil, and that was something I could live with. I walked back to my apartment that evening, and for the first time in 2 years I felt genuinely at peace, not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because I'd learned that integrity matters more than happiness, that doing the right thing is often painful and complicated, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming someone you're proud to be, and then one final twist reminded me that consequences echo longer than we ever imagine. 6 months after that coffee shop conversation, I received a letter forwarded from my old address, and when I saw the return address was a federal prison, my stomach tightened because I knew who it was from before I even opened it. Marcus Chambers had written to me, and the letter was strange, not angry or threatening like I expected, but almost philosophical. And in his tight, controlled handwriting, he'd written something that I still think about today. "You destroyed my empire, but you gave me something more valuable. You showed me that I'd built my entire life on sand, and when you exposed my lies, I finally had to face the truth about who I'd become. A man so terrified of being ordinary that I became a monster. And now, sitting in this cell with nothing but time, I realize that you were the only person brave enough to stop me. And I hate you and thank you in equal measure." I read that letter 3 times. trying to understand if it was genuine or just another manipulation. And I still don't know, but it made me realize that even villains are human, broken and damaged in ways that made them dangerous. And that understanding someone's pain doesn't excuse their crimes, but it might explain them. I never responded to Marcus, never gave him the satisfaction of knowing his words affected me. But I kept the letter as a reminder that every person we meet is fighting battles we don't see, and that the line between victim and villain is sometimes thinner than we want to believe. Jessica got married to her teacher boyfriend, and she invited me to the wedding, and I went, and I watched her promise to honor and cherish someone with the kind of sincerity that comes from having broken those promises before and understanding their weight. And I realized that second chances are gifts we give ourselves when we've learned from our failures. As for me, I continued my quiet life doing work I believed in, building relationships based on honesty, and trying every day to be someone my younger self would be proud of. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Face our choices, learn from our mistakes, and try to leave the world slightly better than we found it. The story of Marcus and Jessica and me became a cautionary tale in business schools, a Netflix documentary that I didn't participate in, and eventually just another headline that faded into the archives. But for those of us who lived it, the lessons remained. That integrity costs something, that truth matters, and that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight, not for victory, but for principle. So if you're facing your own Marcus, your own betrayal, your own moment of choosing between what's easy and what's right, I want you to know this: the pain of standing up for truth is temporary, but the regret of staying silent lasts forever. And you're stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and capable of more than you imagine. And sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to become the villain in your own story. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that truth and integrity still matter in a world that often rewards neither.